Hey your friends, welcome back to Smash Cut Scripts and the continuation of our mini-series, Society Off Script. Today we'll be talking about my most recent hyperfixation, Frankenstein. The second I read this book, I thought, my goodness, I have to write my next episode on this and drag you guys along for my ramblings. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein was originally released in 1818. However, in 1831 she made some edits and revised it, and that's the version I read. We'll be discussing how creative choices are often overflowing with sociological conditions, and specifically for this series, looking at Emile Durkheim's theory of anomie. If you're unfamiliar with Durkheim's theory of anomie from this book, it explores social conditions, expectations, and norms, but he also discusses normlessness, which is the collapse of social stability, collective conscience, as rules and expectations weaken. Durkheim states that people function better when they have roles they can contribute to society with, and he also emphasizes the importance of understanding the interdependence of our roles as it encourages unity and belonging. The individual experience of anomie is called anomia, which is when belonging decreases and disconnection increases. Before we dive into it all, it's important to know the style the novel is written in and of course meet the characters. So Frankenstein is an epistolary novel, which means it's written as though it's told through letters and diaries. It creates a sense of realism as though these events were truly documented. And the important characters to note are, first, Captain Robert Walton, a man leading an expedition in Antarctica, and he is the person who is documenting the events of Frankenstein, first through letters to his sister, and then by writing a document as Victor recounts his story. Second, Victor Frankenstein, the story's protagonist, who discovers the secret to creating life. Third, the creature, who I refuse to refer to as the monster. He is Victor's creation, who must navigate a world completely separated from people. Fourth, Elizabeth, an orphan who is considered Victor's cousin, but not by blood. She is raised by the Frankenstein family and is promised to marry Victor once they grow up. Then there's William, Victor's younger brother, Justine, a housekeeper and family friend to the Frankenstein family, and lastly, Henry Clerval, Victor's closest friend. Now with some context to what we'll be discussing, let's continue. Spoilers ahead, obviously. Something I really love about the story of Frankenstein is its depiction of how human depravity and lack of belonging is experienced by individuals. At its most bare-bones structure, the story is a retelling of God and his creation of man, except where the creator Victor Frankenstein is not a perfect, omniscient, and loving being, and instead a mutually depraved being driven by ambition. We see his creation, the creature, start as a being with the potential to live benevolently, and especially his yearning to do so, but the rejection of the world, and especially his creator Victor, turns him to anger and vengeance. We see him consciously step into the mold of being a wretch upon the earth, which was constantly laid in front of him. Mary Shelley's book is unique and compelling for many reasons, though its exploration of some of the core needs of humanity, being relationship and belonging, I personally felt were the most captivating elements. And for the sake of exploring the sociological theory of anomie and the creative choices which display it, I'll focus on these elements. Victor comes from a very loving family. He describes his parents as having inexhaustible stores of affection, and that being their child made him the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery. Victor even recounts his parents being aware of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life. He states he was guided by a silken cord, a metaphor for his idyllic childhood. However, a cord limits movement, so it also tells us it created boundaries. Boundaries which we will eventually see snap during his pursuit of creating life. These descriptions only occur across 2 pages, but they're key because it shows the fulfilled needs he grew up with. His creators, being his parents, understood the role they had in nurturing him as he grew, which is key for 2 reasons. First, it eventually directly contrasts the lack of nurturing and care Victor treats his creation with. Shelley uses this early characterization of Victor to subtly foreshadow the future juxtapositions between himself and the creature. Second, the metaphor of the silken cord emphasizes the positive environment Victor grew up in, and the opportunities this presented him with to grow, learn, and develop interests safely. However, it also hints to the boundaries that a cushioned life creates, which Victor eventually pulls away from during college. As passion for knowledge overtakes him, we see him consciously snip those ties in order to achieve his desires. His childhood is an essential setup of the themes nature versus nurture, and/or fate versus free will. They somewhat go hand in hand, but differentiate at times. Then, Elizabeth joins the family as an orphan, and they're promised to one another for future marriage. Victor states, "Till death she was to be mine only," which creates another juxtaposition between Victor and the creature, as Victor was always promised a companion and had that relationship to look forward to. In Victor's recount to Walton, he reflects on the difference between someone like himself and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is described to have a calmer and concentrated disposition and a satisfied spirit at the appearance of things. Simply, she was delighted by the world around her and was happy to experience it as it was presented to her. However, Victor was deeply smitten with knowledge and knew he was capable of intense investigations into the causes of the world around him. One of my favorite quotes from Victor regarding his inner nature is, "It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the physical secrets of the world." As a reader, we can see this domestic sort of life is at odds with his deeper passion and curiosity for knowledge, which in the end will be his reason for metaphorically snipping the silken cord we spoke of earlier. This opening highlights Durkheim's theory that when people function within clear roles and have social/moral norms to guide them, they're more content and better off. Victor grew up with a clear role, and that was to be the loved child of his parents, whilst his social norms were to learn, explore, and care for family, especially Elizabeth. His positive childhood, in which he understands his place, is impactful throughout the book. He constantly reminisces on his childhood as the only time he was truly content. There are multiple facets of the theory of anomie, and in my previous video we looked specifically at the breakdown of collective conscience and to the effects this has on a society. Frankenstein specifically highlights Durkheim's idea that social cohesion and roles are beneficial because it creates something he calls social control. Now, social control probably sounds negative to you, but Durkheim strongly viewed it in a positive light because it isn't used as a power tool, but instead it actually fosters social cohesion. Social control within discussions of anomie refers to how shared values naturally guide people how to behave. It sets the parameters in which people function by setting the social expectations and moral values of that society, hopefully guiding them to not behave outside of this and therefore strengthening the values of that society. In a similar way, shared values guide and limit the desires of an individual within that society. Without shared values and social norms, people's personal desires would know no limits, and therefore dissatisfaction would increase. Thus, disorder would perpetually increase because people would be behaving and pursuing in accordance only with what they want to achieve, rather than what is beneficial for the whole society. This facet of anomie helps us consider Victor's circumstance and what ultimately leads to his negative character arc. Shelley has established that Victor has grown up in a caring environment with the shared values that family, altruism, and love are ultimately the most rewarding things someone can achieve. And while he was functioning within these expectations and even anticipating marrying Elizabeth to form their own loving family, his desires were generally limited and guided by these simple pleasures of life and relationships. With this in mind, I want us to remember the metaphor he uses of the silken cord, which perfectly embodies the notion of social control. He was raised in a positive environment which guided his desires and behaviors. However, as we're about to see, there was something for Victor that was missing that leads to his eventual experience of anomia. Next, although we're still in Victor's childhood, I thought I would separate this as it sets up more directly the themes of fate versus free will. Victor by chance finds the works of Cornelius Agrippa, a German physician, theologian, scholar, and occultist who wrote many philosophical texts regarding the world's natural magic, whose inquiries were quickly considered scientifically baseless. So Victor's father tells his son not to waste time on this book, simply calling it sad trash, rather than explaining that Agrippa's principles had been exploded by modern science. Due to his father's lack of explained warning, Victor, with childish blindness and a newfound passion to learn natural philosophy, continues to seek other authors. For a while, these studies allowed his imagination and fascination in discovering the world run wild. However, after a freak thunderstorm in which a tree is destroyed by lightning, a researcher explains the laws of electricity to him, which completely shatters his understandings from what he'd been reading. He immediately feels disdain for this would-be science that he had so foolishly become a disciple of. Well, Victor states, as he looks back with hindsight, it seems that the miraculous and timely event of a lightning strike, destroying a tree, and changing his interests was a last-ditch effort by his guardian angel to dissuade him from the thirst of knowledge for this science. He admires it was a strong effort from the spirit of good, but it was useless because destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. Fast forward some time, and Victor moves away to Ingolstadt for university and meets his professors. He again blames chance and the evil influence of the angel of destruction for turning his steps toward a professor of natural philosophy. Victor is essentially mocked by this professor for having wasted so much of his time on these authors and is given a new list of modern books to pursue, but he walks away feeling absolutely zero inclination to revisit natural philosophy. Until, out of boredom, he heads to another lecturer during a class, and Victor claims that the professor's words were of fate and were uttered only to lead him to destruction. He describes feeling as though his soul was grappling with a palpable enemy, and soon his mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. "So much has been done," exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. "More, far more will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore known powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation." I cannot begin to express how much I absolutely loved this moment and loved this line within the book. It describes his descent into mad passion and his unquenchable thirst for knowledge and grandeur. It's the beginnings of his detachment from shared values as he leans into his new and unlimited desires to be renowned for his scientific discoveries. The sudden switch in point of view emphasizes the monumental switch within Victor to pursue this science, as though something powerful has overcome him and he cannot help it. This chapter ends specifically with the line, "Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny." But this is where we're challenged as readers to question whether it really is fate or if it was Victor's free will. Victor clearly feels that his following miseries are attributed to destiny and spirits pulling him this way and that. However, as an audience, we're able to see that at every stage, Victor was not a passive character and actively pursues these paths. He asks M. Waldman, the professor who reignited his passion for natural philosophy, for more books to study and eventually the equipment from his laboratory. The professor is glad to see someone so young in pursuit of this science and even goes so far to say, "If your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success." This to me is a key moment, even though it passes quite quickly. The professor acknowledges Victor's natural ability, talent, and passion toward this science. However, the word application emphasizes the necessity of Victor's purposeful devotion to progressing in the field, altogether implying that reaching potential can only be achieved through intentional pursuit, thus stripping Victor of the luxury to blame his misery on fate. Next, we'll discuss Victor's success and creation of the creature. His first success is discovering the secret of reanimating lifeless matter. In this section, Victor begins separating himself from society more and more, mostly out of pure obsession with his experiments rather than malicious intent. He stops eating, drinking, or sleeping properly, and also stops writing to his family in Geneva. The theory of anomie tells us that people function better when connected to one another due to a sense of belonging, but also collective values which help regulate people's behaviors and desires. We can see clearly what this separation from society is doing to Victor. He increasingly becomes driven by the prospective glory that could result from completing this scientific discovery. Multiple times he anticipates the glory that would be bestowed on someone for erasing disease and death from humanity. The more isolated he becomes, the more his internal thoughts begin twisting into ones like the following. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. This is really where we start to see Shelley's creative choice to utilize the fall from grace style character arc over the typical hero's journey one. The arc that typically occurs in a hero's journey starts the character at a fairly normal state, and the external conflicts force them to rise to the occasion and ultimately come out a better person. However, in Frankenstein, we watch firsthand Victor's descent, and this negative character arc be the catalyst for all that follows. As I mentioned before, Frankenstein is written in an epistolary style, so whilst Victor is telling his tale, he also interjects with reflections with the benefit of hindsight. He regretfully looks upon his past self that cut off interactions with his family, especially knowing what his father would have said. He also states that if any study you apply yourself to actively weakens your previous affections for life and family, as well as change your interests from simpler pleasures of life, then it is unlawful and isn't appropriate for the human mind. As an audience, we can see the duality of Victor. The two creative choices of a negative arc and the epistolary style enable us to see how the separation from societal norms and a collective conscience destroyed the social regulation he had been functioning in previously, and allowed the pursuit of this unnatural experiment. The harshness of his descent hits even harder upon seeing the creature come to life. Victor is immediately disgusted at what he created and says, "But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." And he sprints from the room and collapses onto his bed. Then after some time, he wakes to the creature standing over his bed. It seems to try and mutter something, and when it raises its hand, Victor fears it will pin him down to the bed, and so he swiftly escapes to his courtyard. His night is filled with terror and disappointment until morning comes and he escapes to the street. The following section of the book is relatively long. Victor immediately runs into his childhood friend, Henry Clerval, who, after seeing Victor's emaciated frame and his paranoia thinking the creature will appear in the street, he nurses him back to health for a few months until they receive word that Victor's little brother William was killed and Victor returns home. On his way, as he's journeying through the pitch black forest, lightning strikes and he sees the silhouette of the creature just in the distance watching him. He freezes in terror and immediately surmises William's death was the result of the creature. It goes dark, and as lightning strikes again, he sees the monster escape up a mountain. I'm going to skip mostly over the next chapters because from Victor's perspective, it doesn't feed much into our discussions of Anomie. However, a notable detail for the creature's telling of his tale is the trial over William's murder. A woman called Justine, the housemaid and family friend of the Frankenstein family, who raised William like her own son, is framed by the creature by placing a locket William owned in her pocket. She receives a trial, but ultimately the evidence of having the locket is too damning and she is sentenced to death. Overall, Victor is extremely overwhelmed with guilt for months, experiencing deep inner turmoil and fears his creature will appear at any moment. Thus, his hatred for his creation increases. Now for my favourite part, because it's the creature's turn to tell his tale. Now, the creature's tale displays the more severe side of what happens when people are deprived of basic human needs. As a reminder so far, in regards to our discussion of Anomie, we have seen practically how when people are nurtured in a caring environment amongst social cohesion and shared values, they have stable guidance on how to behave and regulated desires. We've also seen how isolation from these norms eventually turn people to chaotic pursuits of unlimited desires that lead to a lack of belonging and connection to society. The creature's tale displays the more severe side of what happens when people are deprived of basic human needs. Thus is a practical display of how anomie is experienced by the individual. Victor takes what is essentially a multiple month-long hiking trip for his mental health and comes face to face with his creation in the depths of the forest. The creature approaches his creator with a request, but is met with Victor's rage. Victor calls him the devil and questions how the creature dare approach him after all he's done, and that he will gladly trample him into dust if he doesn't leave. The creature, being expectant of this reaction, continues to plead with his creator. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable among all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. Victor continues to yell and curse him, but the creature persists. I will be even mild and docile towards my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, which thou owest me, to whom thy justice, and even thy clemency, and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. Shelley immediately characterizes the creature through his speech, as it includes far more Old English compared to other characters. As an audience, we don't know yet the reason is because he has had to learn everything he knows through observation and through older books and poems. But he is immediately different from other characters, which helps emphasize the distance he's experienced. Victor is persistent in denying him, so the creature turns to begging. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. Hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense before they are condemned. And I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the works of your hands. Finally agreeing to the creature's requests, the creature takes him to a more comfortable location in a cave, and on the way, Victor internally admits, for the first time also, I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. The creature begins by explaining the strange experience of coming to life without understanding or guidance on what the separate sensations were of sight, touch, or even hunger, that even learning to distinguish his functions and the realization that he had control over his movements, such as walking and blinking, were difficult to understand. He wanders the forest alone, desperately cold and hungry, describing himself as a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. Over time, he slowly observes birds and the beautiful sounds they make, and even tries to mimic them, but is horrified by his own sounds. He finds and learns how to keep a fire going, and then eventually, motivated by finding better food and shelter, finds a village in which he is met with screams, terror, and people pelting him with stones until he runs away and hides in a cottager's hovel. Over approximately a year, he observes the cottagers who live there and their lives, all the while staying hidden, fearing how they would react. However, their kind behaviours and gentle manners and sweet interactions win over his innocent affections and spark curiosity and fascination in what it would be like to be treated in such a way. He notices, however, that they too struggle with life despite having each other, and he figures out it's due to poverty and arduous labour. So he actively helps them by collecting wood for them at night and leaves it in piles for them to find in the morning, so that they have more time to repair the cottage or cultivate the garden. He observes they communicate through language, but didn't know how to apply the words to meaning yet, and yet he empathizes with their joy and sadness still. Eventually learning to speak and read, his desperation for connection increases, but he knows he's a terrifying being, so he plans to wait until the blind old man is alone to appeal to him first. The creature, in isolation, continues to have reflections like, "When I look around, I saw and heard none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled?" Through the poem Paradise Lost, as well as Victor's journals, the creature learns of creation from two views. First, the loving creation of man by God, and second, the disgusting creation of himself from various parts of other people. He laments, "Hateful when I received life, accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring, after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours. more horrid even from the very resemblance. This is when the creature forms the idea to request an Eve version of himself from his creator, desiring kindness and sympathy and believing himself not completely unworthy of such treatment. Although he hasn't given up on the idea of being accepted by humanity, so after months of waiting for an opportunity to approach the old man, he seizes an opportunity, and for a moment it seems to be going well, as he pleads with the man to consider his sincerity and help him to win over his own family's trust. But the rest of the family enter, and they're all horrified. So they beat him and drive him out, and he escapes completely defeated. Feeling the anguish of his solitude, he wanders through the forest and happens upon a woman who falls into a rapid stream, and he actually saves her, and yet is met with a gunshot wound by a man who misinterprets his presence as an attack. This we see is essentially the final moment of mercy from the creature. He goes on to murder William, Victor's younger brother, and frame Justine for it. Then he approaches Victor to create him a companion of his own kind. That way they can live together separated from humanity entirely. If Victor says no to this, the creature essentially vows to be the greatest torment to his life and inflict the same sorts of misery upon him. Okay, long explanation of his tale, but what do we get from this as an audience? Here is a creature first of its kind, much like Adam was. And he is desperately alone after being rejected by first his creator and then other humans. This strips the creature of ever experiencing cohesion, guidance, and shared values of society, and instead is forced to piece information together from the world around him. Shelley continuously emphasizes the absolute anguish the creature experiences from being isolated from human connection and functioning within society, which through a Durkheim lens is the experience of anomie. The creature observes the roles of the family members and how they work together and yet cannot be part of it. We as an audience are compelled to feel compassion toward him, as he truly seemed to start as a being who desired kindness and love, yet faced with rejection and an illegitimate way of achieving his desires, turns to bitterness, hatred, and revenge. This turn in the creature is not by evil nature, but by the human condition of a genuine need for companionship and social cohesion. In contrast to Victor, who was nurtured and given an environment he could exist cohesively in, the creature was never guided or part of those normal social regulations, as Durkheim describes. By nature, we see his desires to function normally, live out the normal role of a human, and even tries, but is met with the impossibility of truly fitting in. Through observation, he notices a key function which is innate to people, and he cleverly uses this during his plea to Victor to achieve the desire of having an Eve version of himself created. He observes that people have roles, and with these roles come certain functions and obligations. And in regards to the roles of creator and creation, the creature insists Victor owes his creation some form of care and attention, which eventually Victor momentarily agrees with. Eventually, we see the complete separation from social norms and shared values enables the creature to turn to extreme and inhumane ways of trying to get what he desires, regardless of how much he hates himself for it. This is a reflection of strain theory and builds upon anomie, explaining that people will turn to deviance when a social norm is presented to someone but inaccessible, which is exactly what we as an audience observes happens to the creature. Overall, Shelley's Frankenstein highlights two extremes of Durkheim's anomie. Through Victor, we see two facets of social cohesion and social control as a way of helping people belong, guide their behaviors, and regulate desires. As he slips away from this, we see the result of unregulated desires and what this enables people to do when detached from the social norms. Through the creature, we see what happens when someone is completely disconnected from social cohesion, shared values, and connection. We observe his anguish of being presented with the reasonable desire of connection, and yet the inability to achieve it, and thus his turning to deviance because of this. Like in my previous video, I will say that there is a lot I had to leave out that I recommend you read for yourself, because Shelley's story is so much deeper than what I've been able to cover by looking at a single aspect of it. In fact, around 40% of the story still remains, which you can read completely spoiler-free. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and let me know below, as it will really help me as I continue setting up my channel. See you guys in the next video.